welcome everyone today to our third annual Petit Institute for Bioengineering and Bioscience Distinguished Lecture. We started this in 2001. Our first speaker was Dr. Kenneth Shine, who at the time was president of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences. Ron, we got a place up front for you. Our second speaker last year was Art Collins, who is chairman and CEO of Medtronic, one of the largest medical device, medical implant companies in the country. And today, it's a real pleasure to have Sir Richard Sykes, who is the rector of Imperial College London. Now, for those of you who don't understand what a rector is, the term more commonly used in the UK is vice chancellor, but here we would call the person president. He basically, you know, if you're a faculty member, you would view him as the chief servant of the faculty, but he runs the university. And really, the leadership from that person on top is critical, as I hope you realize about Georgia Tech. A lot of what's happened here has been because of the leadership coming from President Clough and our provost, Jean-Louis Chameau, and the deans. Now, Sir Richard Sykes, he was born in Yorkshire, I think raised there as well, and did his first degree, his undergraduate degree in London, graduated with first honors. Went on to do a doctorate in microbial biochemistry at Bristol University, and then began his, what you might call, professional career, joining Glaxo in 1972, 5 years later moving to the US, to Princeton, New Jersey, to the Squibb Institute for Medical Research. He was in Princeton basically 10 years, and then came back to Glaxo, and since being there has gone through a variety of positions, and of course Glaxo has evolved in its own way, from Glaxo to Glaxo Wellcome to GlaxoSmithKline, a major pharmaceutical company. His last 2 years there, he was chairman of the board of GlaxoSmithKline, but he also took on, a few years ago, the position of rector at Imperial College. And I know from my friends at Imperial College that he's been a very positive influence there. He has many honors to his credit. He's a fellow of a number of different professional societies, fellow of the Royal Society. He has a number of honorary degrees, and he received his knighthood on the New Year's list in 1994. He really brings sort of a unique perspective, and that's why we're so privileged to have him as our distinguished lecturer this year, because he's been a researcher, he's been a corporate leader, and he is now an academic leader. And so it's a real pleasure for me to welcome you, Richard, and to turn the podium over to you. We're all looking forward to your talk on harnessing new technologies to improve health. Let's welcome him.
Thanks very much, Bob, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's certainly a great pleasure to be asked to give the Petit lecture this year, and I want to thank Bob for that, because obviously he was the instigator who got me involved, and it's a great pleasure to have that opportunity. And during my talk today, I want to share with you some of my ideas about how health management may change over the next few decades. And in particular, I want to describe how new technological advances might change the look and feel of healthcare, and then consider what barriers there might be to progress. But first, let's take a somewhat analytical view of healthcare. So, what we see here are 6 major themes that appear to be of particular importance in creating the drive for advances in medical capability. Prevailing medical needs, technological possibilities, demographic and social values, expectations, economic realities, and the political and regulatory environment. And understanding these factors and how they come to play with each other is vital to understanding how the potential for scientific and medical advances can be fully realized. And although what I want to concentrate on today in my lecture are technological possibilities, I'll also touch on some of these other areas because they are quite important. So first of all, let's look then at present and future medical needs as we might see them. And although medical care is constantly improving, I believe that needs, at least over the next 2 decades, will remain very similar to those that we see today. Cancers, degenerative diseases, infectious diseases, diseases due to changing dietary habits, lifestyle, etc. And as these figures demonstrate, the common scourges afflicting today's society represent a challenge of immense scale. And if we just think about Alzheimer's disease, that's a pretty terrifying statistic when you think about it, on neurodegenerative diseases generally. Asthma, and asthma, if we just take the UK, 3 million people a year in the UK are affected by asthma, and that includes a lot of young children. Children today are becoming much more prone to asthma than they ever were in the past. Breast cancer, still an enormous problem. Heart disease, still the world's biggest killer. And of course, obesity, diabetes, now becoming a real problem throughout the world, not just in the Western world, but certainly also in the developing world. And we now believe that obesity may well be a major risk factor underlying some of the most important causes of morbidity and death today. There are clear links, of course, with obesity to type 2 diabetes, to stroke and to heart attacks. And there are also apparent links to cancer. Certainly the incidence of breast, uterine and colon cancers are all elevated several-fold in the obese population. And they may well be links to other conditions too, such as degenerative joint diseases. And it's therefore pretty obvious, I believe, that tackling obesity would have enormous and far-reaching impacts on health in general and also the economic status of individuals and nations. And various approaches, often in combination, will certainly be needed, including alterations in lifestyle and selective drug therapy. However, as in so many other aspects of health management, a major education campaign will also be required, far more effective than the ones that we offer today. These statistics that are shown here on obesity and diabetes illustrate the scope and depth of the problem. Worldwide, something like 300 million people are now clinically diagnosed as being obese. You know, in the United States, it's quite a high number, but it's not very different in countries in Latin America or in Europe. And obesity underlines something like 5,000 deaths per week in the US, a big number. In the UK, diabetes costs the health service £165 every second. And so these are statistics that are really coming now for people to understand and bear on this problem. And as we can see, there are major social, economic, health-related issues associated with obesity, diabetes and their sequelae. And obviously, these are not just cosmetic problems. And I have to say that because I'm not sure that all doctors today yet see the real importance of dealing with these issues of overweight and obesity. And I'm certain that those who have to pay for healthcare provision always rate these treatments of not worthy of reimbursement. And if this is a representative of society's determination to tackle the problem, then we've obviously got a hell of a lot to do in changing understanding and opinions, as well as developing new medical approaches to some of these issues. Now, as the media are constantly alerting us, infectious diseases continue to represent an enormous challenge to biomedical research and healthcare delivery. Still today, 1/3 of deaths worldwide are caused by microbial diseases. Bacterial diseases, TB. We thought TB had disappeared from the face of the earth, yet 2 billion people remain infected. And it kills about 2 million people a year, many of those again young children. Viral diseases, an enormous problem. Influenza, still a major killer. HIV, of course, major killer, 36 million people infected, many more have died. Hepatitis C, a big problem, something that we wouldn't have known about 10 years ago. So these are diseases that really are modern diseases, if you like, for all sorts of reasons. Parasitic diseases that we tend not to think about, but still an enormous problem for morbidity in the developing world. 200 million people are affected by schistosomiasis. And of course, malaria still kills 3 million people a year, most of those children under the age of 5. So these are still significant diseases. And then, of course, on top of all that, we've got prions. And not only do such diseases represent personal logistical burdens, but increasingly ethical dilemmas arise. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of those. We now have the capability to detect these abnormal prion proteins in surgical biopsies. But without any current hope of treatment, what do we do with the information if we know that those prions are present? Or if we believe that the increased the mobility between countries is responsible for spreading diseases to countries where the disease was not previously present, is it acceptable then to insist that certain people be screened before immigration permission is given? And those are big debates that are going on in Europe at the present time. Of course, society needs and expectations are also changing as a result of the aging population. And an aging population has both medical and economic impacts. The prospect for major economies that around 20% of the population will be over 65 by 2020 must mean that healthcare services will need to look for new ways to help the infirm. Often, less people-intensive measures will be needed. For example, use of technology associated with activities of daily living will enable more elderly, often infirm people to live longer in their own homes. And such technology, of course, could comprise of aids to help people move and manipulate, but it will almost certainly involve a range of monitoring devices which allow for effective remote care. Such technological care could well prove to be more effective in some circumstances than medical intervention in terms of quality of life and certainly the cost of care. So I think then we can all agree that there are still enormous medical challenges. And what I want to do this morning is to explore how new technologies will lead to new capabilities, which in turn will raise new possibilities in medical care. It's not an exaggeration to say that science today is unrecognizable from that of 100 years ago, when transistors were unknown and the secrets of the basis of life and disease were a mystery. Now we can decode the genomes of organisms in a matter of days or at most a few weeks, as was done, of course, with the SARS virus that we all heard about. The microelectronic revolution, too, has been amazing. For example, it's now possible to integrate around 1 billion transistors on a single silicon chip, 1 or 2 centimeters square. And so even the most mundane of everyday goods today now has smart technology embedded within it. And the pace of change seems even faster. And here I've shown a few of the next generation of technological platforms which are already starting to revolutionize our ability to understand the basis of disease and at least do something about it in practical terms, more often finding cures than palliation. Taken together, these technological advances will lead to a whole range of new ways of managing disease, from diagnostics to cure. And going all the way through that diagnostic process, of course, one of the great attractions should be the prevention of disease. If we can understand the underlying mechanisms and do something about it before disease actually occurs, then that prevention area is going to be so critically important both for the quality of life and also, of course, in terms of economic gain. current drug therapy and surgical approaches will be supplemented or even replaced by new types of intervention to improve longevity and the quality of life. And crucially, we're starting to view an investment in health management as a prerequisite to sustained economic growth. And I believe that many of the step changes in our knowledge and capabilities to improve healthcare will result from the fusion of the basic sciences and technologies. So it's critically important that we still teach mathematics and anatomy and physiology and chemistry and medicine, but these, of course, will help us to develop new platforms such as bioengineering, biotics, imaging, tissue engineering, which then will lead to give us new healthcare tools so that we can do robotic surgery, so that we can do non-invasive diagnosis, so that we can have preventative medicine. And of course, these in turn will lead to enhancing and improving the quality of life. And creation of such possibilities are going to thrive in environments which encourage multidisciplinary research. And these new fused technologies are inevitably going to cause somewhat of a perturbation in the provision of healthcare, as they may not fit easily into existing models of payment or provision. And there's also a potential that they will change the shape of the industry, particularly as the current healthcare industries, such as biopharmaceuticals, may not be ideally placed at present to capitalize on this type of multidisciplinary approach. So, listed here then are my 9 new capabilities which I believe will be particularly important in transforming health in the 21st century. And although I don't pretend that the list is exhaustive, I do believe that advances in all these areas are already beginning to make an impact, and more major benefits are likely to become widespread during the next 2 decades. And as I deal with each one of these in turn, I hope you will see just how important it is this fusion of different engineering and scientific disciplines is becoming in defining healthcare solutions for the future. So let me start then with some exciting aspects of structural biology. And using modern X-ray crystallography and NMR techniques, we can now begin to understand how biological molecules interact with each other. Receptors with their ligands, enzymes with their substrates, and from such knowledge we can start to build and design new drug molecules from the bottom up, and hence improve the efficacy of drug design and discovery process. So here we can see a bit of the protein structure in the corkscrew. The veil, the white veil, represents the active site, in this case of an enzyme, and there tucked in the active site is a molecule which is actually inhibiting the enzyme because it's fitting where the normal substrate would go into that active site, and there it's being co-crystallized with the enzyme, with the protein, and we can see exactly how that structure fits into the active site. And we at Imperial, as many other places, have now established a Centre for Structural Biology to exploit such techniques and technologies and thus understand the biological interactions better, with a view to finding better therapeutic targets. And what I want to show now is just how we're using some of this information and target data to actually think about developing new types of drugs. And increasingly we're starting to link gene defects to potential drug targets. And as an example, a number of rare lipid malabsorption diseases have recently been identified, and a gene that's responsible for lipoprotein transport has recently been discovered at a team at Imperial College. And what known mutations in this gene cause a complete block of dietary lipid absorption by interfering with the protein function. You can actually see these mutations, they're in purple here on the protein, and those mutations then stop the action of the enzyme and prevent lipid absorption. And whilst no clear therapeutic target for treatment of these rare diseases themselves emerges from this new knowledge, what it does though, the mutations give us a clue to how the enzyme binds its substrate and hence then suggest a strategy for creating a new breed of anti-obesity drugs, because we can see then that if you can stop lipid absorption, that obviously is going to help in that process. So they would develop drugs for a much wider population, and work in that area is already started. And this is again an excellent example of the increasingly important process whereby a disease is genetically characterized, a specific gene and its product have been identified, and then a drug discovery strategy has been proposed. And this leads nicely then to the second topic on my list, which is genetics. And of course, I can't cover this in any great detail, but what I would like to do is just give you one or two examples of where genetics and associated tools will play a very important role in improving the diagnosis and treatment of disease. The decoding of the genomes of the host, that's us, troublesome vectors such as mosquitoes, and major invading organisms is now starting to shed real light on the molecular basis of disease and pathogenicity. And I'm absolutely convinced that we are now on a new trajectory in medicine, one which leads us to cure and prevention and not just palliation. And it won't be too long before we have ready access to chips with arrays of the complete set of human genes coding sequences for relatively modern costs. Affymetrix already have a gene chip with the entire genome of a person on the chip. The prices of those things will come down quite significantly. And then this, of course, could lead to different types of healthcare in which risks are predicted and managed proactively throughout someone's life. And in fact, examples of those approaches are already starting to take place. And as an example, let's consider how the definition of disease then may actually change. Increasingly, diseases will be defined from a knowledge of a patient's underlying genes, the genotype, as opposed to signs and symptoms, which is the phenotype. And with the improvement of diagnostic capabilities, the heterogeneity of common diseases such as diabetes or Alzheimer's disease will become increasingly apparent. Today, a clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's is made on the basis of behavioral criteria. That is, on the basis of phenotypic information. However, we already know that a number of linkages between gene mutations and apparent disease is there. And if you just look at this slide, you see the presenilins are mutations on chromosome 1 and 21. You've got mutations in other chromosomes and other genes on those chromosomes. And each one of those, of course, leads to what we today define as Alzheimer's. And therefore, it seems very unlikely that a single drug will be appropriate therapy for all patients, unless it's highly likely that the recognition of disease heterogeneity at the genetic level will lead to the development of multiple therapeutic or preventative strategies. There's not going to be one strategy for dealing with those different situations. And to some extent, this is already happening, as we know that the efficacy of the reversible cholinesterase inhibitor Cognex is linked to a lack of the ApoE4 allele. And hence, because of what we know from genetics, 25% of Alzheimer's patients respond to Cognex. And that's because we know that only 25% carry the right genes. So for many common and chronic diseases, the situation may be even more complicated, because we've got multiple contributing molecular variants of several interacting susceptibility genes, and these will lead to multiple clinical outcomes over varying time frames. And here's a simple analysis of type 2 diabetes, which I'll use as an example of how the new knowledge will lead progressively to personalized medical solutions. Already, a number of linkages to type 2 diabetes have been identified. And the trick now is to relate these risk factors to treatment outcomes and hence to optimal treatment protocols. And in such circumstances, diseases might be described in terms of responsiveness to intervention. That is, X-responsive diabetes. The more linkages we find, of course, the more complex the task will become, and hence I don't see a sudden emergence of quick fixes for polygenetic diseases simply on the basis of a greater insight into predisposition genes. However, such knowledge will certainly help in defining lifestyle and medical regimes. The diabetes example leads me to a consideration of the concept commonly referred to as pharmacogenetics. That is, the use of genetic profiles to predict a patient's responses to medicines. Pharmacogenetics is based on the belief that understanding human genetic variations will allow us to explain the differences in the effectiveness and side effects of medicines, and hence fit medication more appropriately to individuals. In other words, personalized treatment. So if we can detect those changes, if we can detect those single polymorphisms within the genome, then we can identify which people are going to be much more susceptible to adverse events or, in a sense, respond more efficaciously to a drug. And by adopting such approaches, it's already possible in some cases to identify subpopulations with either an enhanced efficacy response or an increased incidence of adverse events. And such knowledge then will help us to determine target populations for drugs. In some cases, it may also determine, of course, whether a drug will or not be approved by regulators. If overall efficacy or safety is poor and no simple targeting strategy can be determined, the drug may be non-approvable. And pharmacogenetic approaches are likely to become routine in the relatively near future, say over the next 5 or 10 years. And this will lead to much more specific information being provided on how medicines should be used. That is, what indications should they have, what's the dosage that should be used, the unwanted side effects, general warnings, can all be determined from understanding pharmacogenetics. And general information of this kind will certainly become a standard part of all drug development programs. In improving safety alone, the gains will be significant. In the United States today, adverse events to drugs are the 6th leading cause of death. The FDA estimates that almost 100,000 US citizens die each year from medical errors. That is, the wrong drug to the wrong patient. And adverse events certainly represent a major cause for hospitalization. So if we can do away with a number of those factors, then obviously that's going to be very beneficial. Of course, pharmacogenetic approaches will also allow optimization of efficacy. And here's a very good example of where genetic data has led to the successful targeting of the right drug to the right patient. Herceptin, as you know, is a treatment for a particular form of metastasizing breast cancer. And it shows pretty poor efficacy in the general population. In fact, the efficacy, if you just go into the general population, is about 6%. And in traditional terms then, Herceptin would never have been developed because the efficacy is far too low. However, the recognition that the HER2 gene, which is the human epidermal growth factor receptor, linkage to this changed all that, because in patients that show strong expression of that gene, then you get a much, much better efficacy rate to Herceptin. And that rate shoots up dramatically. So knowing the patients who carry the HER2 gene, which overexpresses itself, then those patients are going to benefit very significantly from Herceptin. And 2 diagnostic tests are now commercially available, and hence the targeting of this drug is achievable. So I'd now like to turn to the third of my nominated breakthrough technologies, and that is Metabolomics, a relatively new concept. And this is being pioneered by a team at Imperial College led by Professor Jeremy Nicholson. And in simple terms, this approach examines how metabolic patterns change with status of health so that new diagnostic and monitoring procedures may be defined. So the steps that are involved here, first of all, we need a biological sample, so that might be blood or urine. Then that sample is just stuck into an NMR machine, so you get an NMR spectrum. The data is then transformed using pattern recognition systems, algorithms, and then from that we can predict whether medical intervention should take place. So this is a pretty exciting technology, and here what I want to show you is some metabolomic profiling that can be used to diagnose important diseases. In this case, 2 bone diseases which are associated with an aging population, osteoarthritis and osteoporosis. And what we've done here, of course, again, is taken some blood, stuck it into the machine. Mathematical transformation of that spectral data is then obtained from those venous blood samples and then being compared with clinical data to predict whether those patients would have the disease or not. So in the first example, which is osteoporosis, the red triangles are just controls. Those people are normal, they do not suffer from osteoarthritis. The blue circles, if that's what they are, blue circles are people who have been diagnosed clinically to have osteoarthritis. And then along come the patients that are blind. And those patients are not clinically diagnosed now. Sample of venous blood's taken from those patients, injected into the NMR machine, their metabolic profiling carried out, and they're the black triangles. So you see black triangles up here, so they don't ostensibly have the disease. You see black triangles down here, and they do. And you can see what then when they go on to be clinically diagnosed, the class prediction is 90% at the 99% confidence limit. And the same with osteoporosis. We've got the same situation down here. The red triangles are the controls. The purple squares are people who've been clinically diagnosed to have osteoporosis. The black triangles, again, are people who've come in blind. They've been tested through Metabolomics, and now there's a 99% class prediction at the 99% confidence limit. So in the case of osteoarthritis, to date there actually been no established biomarkers for disease until the introduction of this technology. So it appears then that we have a simple tool available to monitor disease progress. In the case of osteoporosis, which affects millions of people worldwide and is increasingly more common, it normally requires complex X-ray procedures to assess the magnitude of the problem. This is costly and obviously not suitable for large-scale population screening. This metabolomic test is potentially much faster and a cheaper alternative, allowing more people at risk to be screened early so that progress can be monitored. And equally important, of course, are that new biomarkers generated by this procedure are already giving new information, particularly on mechanisms underlying the disease, and may eventually lead to new drug targets. So this is just one example of where metabolomics now is having a real impact, but there are many others, and you can just imagine that, because in health and disease, the metabolic pattern is going to change quite significantly. The next of my chosen drivers of medical advance is vaccination. And whilst the potential for vaccination as a way of preventing disease has roots in the 18th and 19th centuries, recent advances in vaccine technology lead, I believe, to exciting new opportunities. And this slide shows some of these advances. First of all, genomics and proteomics help us identify new potential targets. DNA vaccines are now becoming fascinating ways of stimulating the immune system directly by just plain DNA, uncontaminated with anything else. Understanding the immune system, of course, critically important, the way that it responds to these antigens. New types of adjuvant to get better antigenic response, but also new delivery technologies. And the conventional concept of vaccination, of course, is the needle and the syringe that we saw up there, but at the bottom here we see a gene gun. And the gene gun really takes gold particles delivered coated with DNA and then delivered non-invasively into the target tissue. And it's becoming clearer that DNA vaccines today will be very useful in a number of important situations. Once more is understood about the technology and the immunization process and the way that the immune system reacts to naked DNA. In fact, advances in understanding of the process involved in immunity and rejection will do much to help us develop a new range of prophylactic and therapeutic interventions. I showed you earlier how malaria, particularly in young children, still remains a major public health problem. At Imperial now we have a major research program seeking new ways to combat the disease at a time when the causative agent, which is Plasmodium, has become resistant to major drugs, and the vector, the mosquito, becoming resistant to most pesticides. And through detailed knowledge of the life cycle of Plasmodium in both the host and the vector, new approaches to combating the disease are being pursued. And already there is good progress on a number of these fronts. Novel methods are being found to disrupt the transmission of the parasite using vaccines, drugs, and genetic manipulation of the vector itself to allow it to mount an immune response against the parasite. So the vector kills the parasite before it can transfer the parasite to the host. So lots of opportunities now using modern molecular technologies to get at malaria. Moving on to Bionics, which is my fifth category of breakthrough technologies. This example shows how advances in our ability to tackle disease will certainly come from interfaces between medicine and engineering. The design of the miniaturized electronic cochlea involves the expertise of a group at Imperial under Professor Chris Tumazu in the bioengineering department, and of course Bob has been very closely involved with this for many, many years. And this particular device now is progressing into humans in the clinic. And although the team already the team are looking further at the creation of artificial retinal implants using this technology to help people with macular degeneration, obviously to give them back some useful sight. And such technologies are based on analog micropower, not digital micropower, so that helps, and they're going to make possible the repair or restoration of function to a variety of organs which in the past would have been deemed irreparable. In actual fact, we know that a number of bionic and biotelemetry devices already exist, such as the implantable heart pacemakers and devices to aid blood flow through diseased organs. However, over the next few decades, such bionic devices are likely to become commonplace, much smaller and less demanding of maintenance. And you can see here some of the things that are actually going on. And advances in creating effective bionic devices will be essential if we're to provide quality of life and acceptable measures of independence for an aging population of patients who survive disease but have increasing levels of disability. And I want to move on to my sixth category of new technology, a very different and very topical issue, and one which illustrates how new technologies demand a change in attitudes and legislation. Stem cell research offers the hope of huge benefits in the treatment of serious illnesses by replacement of diseased or damaged tissues. And in pioneering major advances like this, however, there's frequently nervousness, disbelief, or even open hostility. And all too often, this leads to over-restrictive regulation, which prevents progress. And I recognize that the situation here in the US is quite restrictive, but a number of governments, including the UK government, have taken a brave step, I believe, in creating a clear regulatory framework where such work can now progress ethically. And I'm therefore confident that important progress in this field will be made, and the stem cell culture technologies will lead to therapeutic solutions for a number of devastating degenerative diseases. Here I've shown some basic processes that will be used for engineering tissue transplants. First, stem cells will be directed to differentiate into a stable end-stage cell type. Then they will be encouraged to grow on a suitable biologically compatible scaffold where they secrete proteins needed to form an extracellular matrix and hence form cohesive tissues. The engineered tissue would then be available for transplantation, of which the scaffold would then be reabsorbed while the tissue grows in situ. And work of this nature is being undertaken by biologists, physicians, engineers working together in tissue engineering centres, both here at Georgia Tech and at Imperial. At Imperial we have Dame Julia Polak and Larry Hench that Bob knows intimately, and they've been collaborating for many, many years in these areas. But these are areas now that are starting to take off, things are starting to develop. In fact, a number of recent publications just show how rapidly the potential benefits of cell therapy and tissue engineering are approaching. And you can see some recent announcements here. Also, other announcements include production by American scientists of viable kidney and heart tissues from bovine fetal cells and heart tissue from rat stem cells. And already the potential for using human stem cells to repair diseased hearts is being explored. So a lot of things going on here, quite exciting. My seventh nomination of revolutionizing technologies is imaging. And MRI imaging will undoubtedly grow in its importance as a precise, non-invasive tool for diagnostic and treatment of disease. And it's quite appropriate, I believe, that now this technology has been recognized with Nobel Prizes to Paul Latteber and Peter Mansfield, and it's appropriate that it should be the people who actually develop the science that allow the technology to develop. But this very, very critically important tool. First of all, file compression software already exists to access all this information from a distant or disparate sources. See that in the bottom left there. Thus it will soon be possible to match patients almost instantaneously with medical records anywhere in the world if you have access to that system. Virtual organs that we see here on the right developed from 3D dimensional reconstruction of images also allow surgeons to practice techniques before carrying out the real thing. And the increasing detail that's being achieved by this technology is going to be very, very important also in drug development and in other treatments. And you can do that today using this technology non-invasively, follow coronary artery patency, for example. And to illustrate these new capabilities, here are two video clips of how modern imaging techniques can be used to visualize valve function and blood flow in the heart. And again, it was the work of Peter Mansfield that allowed all this stuff to actually happen. So what we see here on the right, first of all, is blood flow in the right ventricle, and then we can see that the heart in situ. Again, this is using non-invasive technology. Quite remarkable technology, the definition of that today. Another major step forward in using imaging is shown here, the ability to carry out endoscopy whilst tracking the exact position of the tip of the endoscope to with 0.1 or 0.2 of a millimeter. So in this case, the endoscope is actually exploring the epidural space in the spinal column. So we're going up and down the spinal column, and the left dot on the image shows you where the tip of the endoscope is. So such innovations are already being used in medical practice and will allow for major advances in precision and microsurgery. A concept that will become reality in much of future healthcare delivery will be that of sensing and monitoring. And hence, I picked this as number 8 on my list of important new technologies. And here's a glimpse of how healthcare status might be monitored remotely in the near future. And this life shirt has embedded in it sensors that monitor over 30 vital signs of cardiopulmonary function, which are collected by a personal digital assistant, and then these signals are sent at intervals, by an online service straight into a central repository, and then you can get feedback from that. This particular device being developed by an American company called Vivametrics and now has FDA approval for use. So this device is actually on the market. My final category of promising new technologies illustrates how advances in both biotechnology and bioengineering will revolutionize the practice of medicine. On the left is a view of a virtual operating theatre. We have one of these at our premises at Chelsea and Westminster campus. That's a big hospital in London, in which operators can simulate many events to test student capabilities, such as massive hemorrhage and cardiac arrest. Techniques like this, of course, allow modelling of responses to various interventions. But the picture on the right is the real thing. That's the surgery. This is taken at St Mary's, another of our hospital campuses. But here, robots are actually controlling the instruments with precision greater than that can be achievable by the unaided human hand. And the result of the capability to carry out minimally invasive surgery without subjecting the patient to unnecessary surgical damage really comes from this kind of technology. Here, for example, is a patient following minimal invasive coronary artery grafting done by Professor Aradazi at the Mary's campus at Imperial, because he's the guy who's really pioneering these approaches with a robot called Da Vinci. And of course that leads to all sorts of possibilities: telemedicine, surgery taking place where the surgeon is not actually in the location of the patient. All that sort of thing is now starting to become commonplace. And what I'd really like to do is further develop this concept of medical robotics by describing how a mechanical engineering team at Imperial has pioneered a suite of software and hardware tools for use in orthopedic surgery. The interventions of the team, led by Professor Brian Davis, have become the core assets of a spin-out company called Acrobot, which last year won the J&J Best Surgical Innovation Award. And conventional orthopedic surgery and joint replacement surgery in particular has changed little since it was developed in the 1960s. You know what they say about an orthopedic surgeon: strong as an ox and half as intelligent, and it still applies today. But traditional orthopedic tools range from the hammer and chisel to the power drill and saw, and these are used to replace natural human joints with manufactured implants and prostheses. And conventional techniques using these tools obviously require a lot of skill of the surgeon, a lot of training, and involve procedures that are not only stressful to the patient but also stressful to the surgeon. Failure rates in these joint replacement procedures can be as high as 10% for total knee and hip replacements. And a significant number of these failures are actually put down to inaccuracies during the fitting of the implant. So Acrobot researchers have actually developed the concept of active constraint robotics, or ACT, which prevents surgical error by actively guiding the surgeon through the operation. And with this technology, the surgeon remains in control throughout. So you've got proprietary planning software, allows the surgeon to perform the virtual surgery ahead of time. And then during the surgery, the robot provides the precise geometric accuracy and also increases safety by means of a predefined 3D motion constraint, which prevents the cutting anywhere outside the defined region. So here, ideas generated by mechanical engineers have, through intervention with physics, computing and surgery, led to a new generation of capability precision in orthopedic surgery. And the story is far from finished, because already a team are now developing an exciting new capability, which is single condyle replacement surgery. Because in many cases, it's only one side of the knee joint that's severely damaged, and it would be highly attractive if you could just replace that side of the knee joint using minimally invasive surgery techniques, which we can see here. And clinical trials are currently underway, and initial results look extremely promising. You can see here the picture on the right is a CT scan of a knee that's received a single condyle prosthesis. So these things are now starting to be done. So there's no question then that all these technologies that I've talked about and described have got tremendous potential for the future. And I'd just now like to touch on a few of the constraints that could hold back some of these issues. And so these are issues that really have to do with expectations from all this technology, expectations in healthcare, and a willingness to pay for all this stuff that's going to be available. And I'd like to start by considering the expectations of people. Patients are now becoming active, involved consumers of healthcare, a trend which most doctors will not actually welcome. Because patient groups are now becoming more common, more active, and the internet, of course, is transforming the amount of information that can be assessed directly by patients. Already, thousands of internet sites carry health information, and we must anticipate that more households in the developed world will sooner or later have access to this information. In the UK, about 50% of households today have internet access, and I'm sure the percentage is even greater in the US. But the question is, what do people have access to? What is that information? Can we assume that the information is available, will be fairly balanced? Will it be true? Will it be communicated at a level which aids understanding? And obviously there's tangible concern about the way in which advances in science and medicine are represented to the public. The communication issues are major and beyond the scope of today's talk, but the resolution of that's going to play a vital role in ensuring that the expectations of the public are well-founded and realistic, because if we get that wrong, then it could all backfire and things could go badly wrong. A characteristic of today's society, of course, is the growing belief that everything must be 100% safe, and that if it is not, someone has been deceitful or negligent. However, I doubt very much whether most people actually have any real concept of the relative risks that they face in the pursuit of normal everyday activities. And I've shown here some risks for voluntary activities in order to illustrate the point. And if we wish to win patients' confidence in new technologies, I feel we really have to talk much more about the risks and probabilities and less about black and white outcomes. In more general terms, we must look how to educate children and adults about health management so that expectations and demands evolve in a well-elaborated context. Harnessing our impressive resources into public education programs will need a concerted effort from many parties. We scientists and clinicians must always seek opportunities to take a proactive stance whenever we can. Turning now to economic issues, the economic value of an increase in life expectancy is remarkable. According to recent calculations, in the United States, eliminating deaths from heart disease would generate economic value of $48 trillion a year. Curing cancer would be worth $47 trillion a year. But more realistically, just by reducing the death rate from either of these causes by 20% would actually end up saving the US $10 trillion a year, which is more than a year's GDP. So R&D might be expensive, but it's less expensive than that sort of activity. So I think that investment is critically important, that we keep putting money into research and development to reduce this inefficient issue. Here's another compelling example of economic benefits new technology can bring. And you can see here that modern drug therapies for schizophrenia have enabled many patients to actually live outside the hospital, and they do that at greatly reduced cost. And that can be applied, of course, to many other situations. It could be applied to bionic devices or new surgical techniques for other diseases. And of course, the important thing is to look at healthcare holistically, and then you can start to save a lot of money. And we may consider that innovative approaches to medical care are expensive, but at the end of the day, in the long run, they're often going to be cheaper. So, in summing up then, I must turn to the consideration of what might facilitate or frustrate the unlocking of the enormous potential promised by new scientific and technological innovations. And there's no doubt in my mind that these scientific advances in the pipeline today will greatly increase our ability to detect, predict, prevent and treat diseases in the future, and that these advances will emanate from a wide range of new capabilities that we've talked about. Other technologies will also enhance the quality of life for those not considered ill in conventional terms. While some advances will save money overall and thus be welcomed by healthcare providers, demand will certainly increase as we provide much more personalised care. So without doubt, new socio-economic and ethical issues will abound in this new paradigm. In fact, a number are already with us. And I've tried to illustrate here 5 of the major dilemmas which we will have to address if we're going to be really successful in unlocking the potential of new technologies. Individuals have become disengaged from science and medicine. And that's true, I guess, in many Western countries for all sorts of reasons. We've got to bring that trust back into the arena. Personalised medical care is a real possibility, but of course healthcare systems are driving in a different direction. They're delivering healthcare for the greater good, not for the individual. And of course value means different things to different people. Ethical and regulatory environments are going to be critically important, and of course this issue of demand and more is going to be available and can supply meet demand. And these issues only serve to emphasize the thesis that human inventiveness is not going to be the major barrier to improving health. It's all the other issues that come into play. I got no perfect answers to these dilemmas, but I do see closer alignment of expectations of different stakeholders. They're as key to ensuring that the valuable new capabilities realise their true potential. And this means alignments between industry, between healthcare professionals, regulators, governments, and the individual. And that's a tall order because, of course, all those people have different motives and priorities, and sometimes they're bound to differ in one time or another. However, in many healthcare systems, a strategic shift of focus is already discernible, one in which there is a recognition that the quality of care is more important than the cost of containment, and hence the inputs to the system must result in measurably better outputs. So it's now vital that all stakeholders strive to align around the creation of mutually acceptable outputs, and that the apparent preoccupation with metrics actually targets what is important to individuals who one way or another pay for healthcare provision. So in summary, I'm certain that the new technologies will lead to new capabilities and health will benefit as a result. However, I also believe that current healthcare provision paradigms will need to change if access to these new developments is to be guaranteed. Social attitudes to a number of potential changes will be of paramount importance, and I have no doubt that patients or potential beneficiaries will demand a greater say of how their healthcare is managed in the future. And if we can address the economic and socio-political issues I have described, I believe that major changes in medical care will emerge and provide options more tailored to individual needs than they do today. However, to facilitate that transition, I also believe a more satisfactory level of public debate is required. And I think that we have to have all parties involved in that, academia, industry, government, if we're going to make progress. So what I will do now is leave you with my own personal view of these scientific and medical advances which have brought revolutions in the past 2 centuries, and those which I believe will bring revolutions in this present century. And from the 9 new technologies I mentioned earlier, and the outcomes I postulated, I've chosen those which I think will be seen as the major breakthroughs. I'm sure there'll be many others, but I am absolutely convinced that these things will happen, and they will add very significantly to the quality and quantity of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was great. We very much appreciate your being here, and I think we'll take a little time for questions, comments from the audience. Yes.
About pharmacogenetics, I had a question. How would companies make economic sense or equilibrate the cost of developing medicines only for targeted organisms and transplantation?
Would you repeat the question?
Yeah. I think the question is about, we know, well, we believe that companies, pharmaceutical companies, biopharmaceutical companies, are successful today because they produce the, in inverted commas, the blockbuster, which treats everybody and cures nobody, but makes people feel better. Once we start to develop drugs that are targeted to individuals per se, using pharmacogenetics as an example, and disease redefinition, so that asthma is not one disease but 5 diseases, then will the pharmaceutical companies make money? My belief is that yes, they will, because I think they're providing a better service at the end of the day. See, gone are the days when salesmen used to knock down doctors' doors and say, prescribe this at all costs. It doesn't happen, well, it might, but it shouldn't happen anymore. And I think once people can take drugs knowing that they're not going to have an adverse event, that they will benefit from it, the way that people take antibiotics today. You know, you take an antibiotic, normal circumstances, you kill the invader and you're better, you're cured, all done. Now, most disease is not like that because it's not an invader, it's some genetic malformation that's taken place. So therefore you've got to deal with that. Once you deal with it the way you deal with infectious diseases, people's attitudes towards medicine will change. So I believe that yes, you'll be developing specific drugs for specific targeted situations, but they'll work better, they'll have less side effects, they'll be more acceptable, and the cost of developing them will not be the cost of developing a major drug today, simply because they're targeted. When you do clinical trials today, you're very fortunate to get 50 or 60% response rates. Very, very rare. So, because you don't know what population to test the drug in. If you knew which population to test the drug in, it'd make it a lot easier, a lot cheaper. So overall, I think it'll be okay.
Yes.
So Richard, I certainly enjoyed your talk.
Would you take the microphone? Thank you.
So Richard, I certainly enjoyed your talk. I'm an orthopedic surgeon at Emory.
That's why I made the comment I did, you see.
Permit me to correct the description. An orthopedic surgeon has half the strength of an ox and twice the my question is that we certainly have advanced medical care tremendously, but yet the medical malpractice situation is getting out of hand, and there are medical breakthroughs that are not allowed to go through. And let me give you an example of a mundane one. Many years ago, because of problems with intrauterine devices, those devices are not available in the United States. The company went bankrupt. Yet, that's the most effective form of birth control, and it was available everywhere else in the world except the United States. How can we prevent the lawyers from throwing a spanner in the works?
Don't have an answer. I think it's an enormous problem, and I tried to bring some of that out because, as I say, I think we'll go on creating things, we'll go on making things better and better, breaking the boundaries, but there'll always be some mechanism that is keeping that at bay, whatever it is. But I think the litigious society that you have in the United States is now counterproductive to good healthcare. Unfortunately, some of that is spilling over into the UK, almost inevitable, nothing like it is in the United States. But I think that's a big issue that has to be dealt with, because nothing is risk-free, nothing at all. And this attitude that everything has to be black and white, and if not, somebody's responsible, I think has to be dealt with. So I don't have an answer for you, but I think it's a big problem.
Comparing Europe and the United States, I used to think that it was easier to get new technology approved and to patients in Europe than in the U.S., but I have the feeling that some of the actions being taken by the European Union may in fact level the playing field. Do you have any comment on that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, certainly there used to be a time when countries did their own thing and they did the approvals and they got everything sorted out. But the more and more European legislation coming in now into drug. Clinical trials is the latest one that's going to hit the business in 2004. And this will slow down the whole development of drugs in the European Union. So there's a lot of angst about that, particularly in a place like the UK, which is renowned for getting drugs through the system quickly, getting them onto the market. They don't pay for them, but they get them onto the market. They've always been very good, but this legislation is now having a big impact, and I think there's going to be a serious response to that from a number of countries. But the clinical trials initiative is actually very detrimental to drug research.
I think there was a question in the back there. And then we'll go to you, Susan.
As improvement of like health education and the encouragement of healthy lifestyles continues, at least in the United States, do you envision any future role, say, of individual responsibility in the kind of sharing and bearing of the healthcare costs?
Yeah, well, I think individuals do bear that responsibility to some extent in the United States. Still, in most of Europe, healthcare is free at the point of entry, and there's little, unless you want to go for private medicine, which is still quite small in the United States. About 6 to 8% of people have private coverage, and that's usually through employment. But healthcare is free. That is a significant issue, because then people want everything. They can't have everything. So how do governments control that? They control it with waiting lists. So the only way is to have a gatekeeper that stops you getting in there. Although it's free, you can't access it. And that's becoming an enormous problem. So again, I think you're going to see a big change where patients are going to be asked to contribute to their healthcare. One, so that they can understand the real costs of the healthcare provision. Today in the UK, GPs have about less than a minute or 2 minutes with each patient that goes to see them. So you have people who really need a GP. 80% of them shouldn't be there in the first place, but it's all free, so why not? And you don't have to go to work if you go to the GP, so you can sit there for 3 hours, do nothing, and go back to work afterwards. So if you pay £10, for example, just to visit your GP, you probably drop the numbers significantly and make these people much more effective in dealing with their patients. So what you need is an autocracy to sort this lot out. The problem in a democracy, nobody dares do anything, otherwise, people complain. But something's got to be done.
Susan Cousins.
This is a follow-up question to that. You're obviously a big fan of individualized medicine and see that as the wave of the future, but I was surprised to see you juxtapose that with achieving the greatest good, and that medical systems are oriented to achieving the greatest good. That's a little bit of an unconventional view, because many people are in favor of the greater good. Can you expand on your ethical position on that a bit?
Well, my point there was that most healthcare systems are developed for the greater good, not for individualized healthcare. But of course, we're going in that direction. We're moving in the direction of individualized healthcare. Of course, and I don't think the two things are incompatible. Obviously, research and development and everything that goes on will eventually be for the greater good, whether you do it for individualized healthcare initially or you do it for populations. But today, because we treat everybody the same, so in this room, if you said, well, I've got hypertension, you get a similar sort of drug. Whereas if you looked at the genetics of your hypertension, that drug that you were given may only work in 40% of you, the next drug may work in another 20%, and so on. So that's what I'm talking about. So if you say the greater good is to treat 40% of you and the rest of you suffer, it doesn't seem good to me, whereas if you can all be treated individual in the sense that you all fit in the same kind of hypertension because you've all got the same genetic modification, then surely the benefit is for the greater good, but you've been benefited as individuals because you've been identified as belonging to this group and not a homogeneous group that really is only defined by a phenotype and not by a genotype.
I think we probably need to bring this formal lecture to a close. A couple things before we do that. Number one, I certainly thank you again, Richard. There is a very nice honorarium that goes with this lecture. This envelope is symbolic of that. I say symbolic because it's an empty envelope. Why is it an empty envelope? Well, you know, Sir Richard is used to dealing with faculty, and faculty are used to giving empty envelopes to the administration. But in fact, the easiest way to handle this for someone coming from the UK is a bank transfer. So it is symbolic of our thanks for a wonderful lecture and for your being here. And let's close with a round of applause, and I welcome all of you to the reception.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yes,